I still have the keys she never returned, sitting in my junk drawer like evidence of my own stupidity. 6 months after I had to change my locks, she's telling everyone who will listen that I'm the toxic friend who abandoned her when she needed me most. People always ask how someone like me, supposedly smart, successful, good at reading people, could get so completely played by someone like Maya. The truth is, it wasn't obvious at first. Maya wasn't a stranger who showed up at my door with a sob story. She was my friend, someone I'd known for 8 years, someone I genuinely cared about who found herself in what seemed like a genuinely terrible situation. Before we get into the part that still hurts to tell, let us know where you're watching from and hit subscribe so you don't miss more deep, raw stories like this. We met during our senior year of college, in a Victorian literature class that neither of us particularly wanted to take but both needed for our English degrees. Maya was the kind of person who made everything more interesting, quick-witted, effortlessly stylish, with opinions about everything and the confidence to share them. She could turn a boring discussion about Dickens into something that actually held my attention, could make even the most pretentious classmates laugh at themselves. Our friendship developed naturally over study sessions and coffee dates, late-night conversations about books and boys and what we wanted to do after graduation. Maya was studying to be a teacher, I was heading toward marketing, but we shared enough interests and humor to stay close even after college when our lives went in different directions. Maya moved to Portland to teach elementary school. I stayed in our college town and worked my way up at a small advertising firm. We kept in touch through social media and occasional visits, the kind of friendship that could pick up where it left off even after months of minimal contact. When she posted pictures of her classroom or funny stories about her students, I felt proud of her. When I got promoted or moved to my current apartment, she was genuinely happy for my success. For years, our friendship felt balanced and authentic. We both had our own lives, our own problems, our own achievements. Neither of us was particularly needy or dramatic. Maya dated sporadically. I had a long-term relationship that ended amicably. We were both independent people who enjoyed each other's company without requiring constant maintenance of the friendship. That's why the phone call last October felt so shocking. I was at home on a Tuesday evening, catching up on work emails while watching Netflix when my phone rang at almost 10 p.m. Maya's name on the screen immediately worried me. We texted regularly but rarely called, and never this late. Her voice was shaky, congested from crying, barely recognizable. She told me that her boyfriend David had lost his temper during an argument and shoved her hard enough that she hit the kitchen counter. She'd locked herself in the bathroom while he screamed threats through the door, then waited until he passed out drunk before grabbing some essentials and leaving. The story came out in pieces over the next hour. David had been gradually becoming more controlling and volatile over the 6 months they'd been living together, monitoring her phone, criticizing her friends, getting angry when she made plans without him. Maya had been making excuses for his behavior, telling herself it was stress from his job, that he'd change once things settled down. But the physical violence was a line she couldn't rationalize away. She'd driven to a 24-hour diner and called me because she didn't know what else to do. Her family lived across the country. Her Portland friends were mostly work colleagues she didn't feel comfortable involving in something this personal, and she was terrified of going back to the apartment she shared with David. I didn't hesitate. "Come here," I told her. "Drive straight here tonight. You can stay with me as long as you need to figure things out." The drive from Portland to my city was about 4 hours, which gave me time to prepare. I cleaned out my spare bedroom, made up the bed with fresh sheets, stocked the bathroom with towels and toiletries. I stayed awake until she arrived around 3 a.m., watching for her headlights in my parking lot. Maya looked smaller than I remembered, fragile in a way that was completely unlike her usual confident presence. She had a duffel bag and a backpack, plus a laundry basket filled with what looked like hastily grabbed belongings. Her left arm had a purple bruise just above the elbow where she'd hit the counter, and there were red marks on her wrist that looked like fingerprints. I helped her carry her things upstairs, made tea, let her talk or cry or sit in silence as she needed. The apartment felt different with her there, more alive maybe, but also more fragile, like we were both holding our breath. She kept apologizing for imposing, for showing up so late, for bringing her drama into my peaceful life. I told her what I genuinely believed at the time, that she wasn't imposing, that I was glad she felt safe calling me, that she could stay as long as she needed to get back on her feet. I meant every word. The first few days were exactly what I'd expected from someone recovering from trauma. Maya slept a lot, cried unpredictably, jumped at sudden noises. She was grateful for everything: the safe place to stay, the food I shared, the presence of someone who believed her story and supported her decision to leave David. She called in sick to work for the rest of that week, spending most of her time in the spare bedroom or sitting quietly on my couch. I worked from home when I could to keep her company, took time off to go with her to file a police report and get a restraining order against David. The bureaucratic process was frustrating and invasive, requiring Maya to recount the abuse multiple times to skeptical officials who seemed more interested in why she'd stayed so long than why she'd finally left. I was proud of her for taking those steps, proud of myself for being the kind of friend someone could call in crisis. It felt good to be needed, to be trusted with something so important, to use my stability and resources to help someone I cared about rebuild their life. The warning signs were so subtle in those first weeks that I barely noticed them. Maya mentioning casually that she'd updated her address with her bank to my apartment, just temporarily until she found her own place. Her relief when I said she could have mail delivered there. The way she started referring to my spare bedroom as her room and my apartment as home when talking to other people on the phone. I rationalized it all as natural adjustment to trauma and displacement. Of course, she needed to feel secure somewhere while she healed. Of course, she was trying to establish some sense of normalcy and routine. Of course, the lines between temporary and permanent would feel blurry when someone was rebuilding their entire life. Maya started going back to work after 2 weeks, but only part-time initially. She said she wasn't ready for the full stress of teaching yet, that she needed time to process what had happened and figure out her next steps. Her principal was understanding about the domestic violence situation and agreed to let her ease back into her full schedule gradually. This meant Maya was in my apartment alone most days while I worked. When I came home, I'd find evidence of her day, coffee cups in the sink, the TV still on whatever channel she'd been watching, her laptop and papers spread across my dining room table. It felt like having a roommate, but one who didn't contribute to expenses or ask before using shared spaces. I told myself this was temporary, that trauma survivors needed time and patience to regain their independence. Maya was dealing with enough stress without me adding pressure about household logistics. She was grateful and apologetic about the imposition, always promising that she was looking for her own place and would be out of my hair soon. But soon kept shifting. First it was after she got back to full-time work, then after she saved enough for first and last month's rent plus deposit, then after the holidays because moving during December was too stressful. Each deadline came with reasonable explanations for why it wasn't quite the right time yet. Meanwhile, Maya was settling into my space in ways that felt increasingly permanent. She bought groceries and put them in my refrigerator without asking what I might need or want. She rearranged my living room furniture to better accommodate her work setup. She invited her coworker friends over for wine nights, introducing them to my apartment as if it were a shared space rather than my home where she was temporarily staying. The boundaries started blurring in small ways that were hard to address without seeming petty. Maya using my expensive face wash and body lotion, claiming she'd run out of her own and would replace it soon. Eating leftovers I'd planned for my lunch the next day, then being surprised when I was annoyed about having to buy food at work. Taking 45-minute showers during the time I usually got ready for work, then seeming hurt when I mentioned the schedule conflict. Each incident was minor enough that calling it out felt disproportionate, but the cumulative effect was that I started feeling like a guest in my own home. I couldn't relax completely because Maya was always there. I couldn't bring dates over because Maya would want to chat and get to know them. I couldn't have my own space and routines because Maya's needs and schedule had to be considered. The most concerning development was Maya's apparent lack of urgency about finding her own place. When I'd ask how the apartment hunting was going, she'd sigh and talk about how expensive everything was, how competitive the rental market had become, how she was being careful not to rush into anything unsafe or financially irresponsible. But when I looked at her laptop screen or heard her phone conversations, Maya seemed to be spending more time on social media and online shopping than on rental websites or apartment viewings. She bought new clothes, went out for dinners with friends, took a weekend trip to visit her sister. None of these were unreasonable activities for someone rebuilding their life, but they suggested someone who was settled and stable rather than someone desperately seeking housing. 3 months in, I started feeling the first stirrings of resentment, not because Maya was ungrateful. She thanked me regularly and often talked about how much my support meant to her, but because the situation had evolved from emergency assistance into something that felt more like Maya had simply moved in with me without asking permission. I began to notice that Maya never offered to contribute to utilities, even though her presence had increased my electric and water bills noticeably. She used my Netflix and Spotify accounts, my Wi-Fi, my kitchen appliances and cleaning supplies, all without acknowledging that these things cost money or that her usage affected my expenses. When friends asked how long Maya would be staying, I realized I didn't have a good answer. The original timeline of a few weeks while she gets back on her feet had stretched into months with no end date in sight. Maya had essentially moved in without either of us explicitly agreeing to that arrangement. I started feeling trapped by my own generosity. I'd offered help to someone in crisis, but that help had been redefined as housing someone indefinitely without my consent. Maya's gratitude felt increasingly hollow when it wasn't accompanied by any effort to return to independence or contribute to the household she'd joined. The turning point came when I overheard Maya on the phone with her sister, describing my apartment as our place and talking about decorating ideas for her room. She mentioned being so much happier now that she was settled somewhere safe, and how nice it was to live with someone who understood her need for emotional support. I realized that Maya had rewritten our arrangement in her mind. What I saw as temporary emergency housing, she saw as permanent living situation. What I understood as extraordinary generosity, she experienced as normal friendship. What felt like a significant sacrifice on my part seemed to register as baseline expectation on hers. I was no longer helping Maya through a crisis. I was subsidizing a lifestyle she'd chosen to adopt without asking if I wanted to be her indefinite roommate. The woman who'd cried on my couch about having nowhere to go had found somewhere to go, my home, and she decided to stay without bothering to check if that was actually an invitation I'd extended. The first time Maya rearranged my furniture without asking, I almost convinced myself it was thoughtful rather than presumptuous. I came home from work to find my coffee table moved against the wall and my armchair repositioned to face the TV at a different angle. Maya explained brightly that she'd been doing some light yoga in the living room and realized the space would flow better with a few adjustments. She'd also added a small bookshelf from her collection of belongings, positioned prominently near the window where my reading chair used to sit. Her laptop cord now snaked across the floor to an outlet that had been perfectly accessible before she decided my furniture arrangement was inadequate for her needs. I stood in my own living room feeling disoriented, like I'd walked into the wrong apartment. The space looked fine, arguably better organized than before, but it no longer felt like mine. Maya was bustling around the kitchen making dinner, chattering about her day, completely oblivious to my discomfort at finding my personal space rearranged without consultation. When I mentioned that I preferred the coffee table in the center of the room, Maya looked genuinely confused. She pointed out that the new arrangement created more open floor space, which was better for both of us. She seemed hurt that I wasn't appreciative of her effort to improve our shared living situation. Our shared living situation, that phrase hit me like a slap. When had my apartment become our shared living situation? But addressing it felt petty and unwelcoming, especially when Maya was clearly trying to contribute in her own way. She'd made a nice dinner, she'd organized the space more efficiently, she was trying to make herself useful rather than just taking up room. I swallowed my irritation and thanked her for cooking, then spent the evening trying to feel comfortable in my rearranged living room. That became the pattern over the following weeks. Maya would make small changes and improvements to my apartment, always with reasonable explanations and genuine intentions to help. She reorganized my kitchen cabinets for better efficiency. She bought curtains for the living room windows because the afternoon sun was creating glare on her laptop screen. She installed a shower caddy in the bathroom to better organize both of our toiletries. Each change was minor and arguably beneficial, but collectively they transformed my space into something that reflected Maya's preferences and needs rather than mine. When I'd express hesitation about a particular modification, Maya would seem hurt and confused. Wasn't I glad she was trying to improve things? Didn't I want the apartment to be comfortable for both of us? The problem was that I'd never agreed to make the apartment comfortable for both of us on a permanent basis. I'd offered temporary emergency housing, not a roommate arrangement where my personal space would be redesigned to accommodate someone else's lifestyle. But Maya operated as if we'd made a mutual decision to live together, and any resistance from me was unreasonable possessiveness of shared space. She talked about our apartment, our living room, our kitchen, with the casual ownership of someone who'd forgotten this was originally someone else's home. The mail situation was another gradual boundary erosion. It started with Maya asking if she could have a few essential items delivered to my address, her new bank cards, some medical forms, replacement documents she'd left behind when fleeing David. All completely reasonable requests for someone in her situation. But over time, Maya's mail became a regular part of my daily routine. Packages from Amazon, subscription boxes, magazine renewals, credit card offers, all addressed to Maya at my apartment. My mailbox was stuffed with her correspondence, my building's package room filled with her deliveries. When I mentioned that the volume of her mail was becoming substantial, Maya pointed out that she'd asked before having things delivered and I'd said yes. She was right, technically. I had agreed to let her use my address temporarily, but I'd pictured a few emergency items, not a complete redirect of her postal life to my home. Maya had also begun referring to my apartment as her address when filling out forms, applying for things, updating her information with various services. She changed her voter registration, updated her car insurance, even listed my apartment as her primary residence on her tax documents. Each individual action made perfect sense. She needed a stable address for practical purposes, and I'd given her permission to receive mail there. But the cumulative effect was that Maya had officially moved in without ever asking if that was acceptable or if I wanted a permanent roommate. The social aspect was equally overwhelming. Maya started inviting people over regularly, treating my apartment like her own home where she could host friends and colleagues. Her teacher friends would come by for wine and grading sessions, spreading their work across my dining room table and staying until late in the evening. Maya introduced me to these guests as her roommate, explaining that we were living together while she got back on her feet after leaving an abusive relationship. The story was technically accurate but framed the situation as if I'd agreed to be her roommate rather than offered temporary emergency housing that had stretched indefinitely. Her friends were lovely people and I enjoyed their company, but I hadn't consented to having regular social gatherings in my home. My apartment had always been my sanctuary, the place where I could be alone and recharge from social and professional obligations. Now it was Maya's social hub, filled with other people's conversations and energy several nights a week. When I suggested that maybe some of their gatherings could rotate to other people's homes, Maya looked hurt. She pointed out that my apartment was the most spacious and convenient for everyone. She reminded me that she'd been through a traumatic experience and that these friendships were important for her emotional recovery. She was right about both things, but that didn't address my need for privacy and quiet in my own home. I found myself staying late at work or going to coffee shops to avoid the constant social activity in my living space. I was becoming a refugee from my own apartment. The financial boundaries were equally murky and increasingly problematic. Maya never offered to contribute to rent, which would have been inappropriate anyway since her name wasn't on the lease and she was supposedly there temporarily. But she also never acknowledged the ways her presence increased my monthly expenses. My utility bills rose significantly with two people showering daily, running electronics, using heating and air conditioning. My grocery costs doubled because Maya would eat whatever food was in the kitchen, often finishing items I'd bought for specific meals or work lunches. She'd replace things sporadically, but not consistently, and never with the same brands or quality I preferred. Maya treated my apartment like an all-inclusive resort where her basic needs were simply provided. She used my laundry detergent, my cleaning supplies, my kitchen equipment, my internet, my streaming services, all without acknowledgement that these things cost money or represented ongoing expenses that I was covering alone. When I tried to bring up the household expenses, Maya would get defensive and emotional. She'd remind me that she was a domestic violence survivor, that she was doing her best to get back on her feet, that she'd never asked me to support her financially. All of which was true, but didn't address the reality that she was using resources I paid for without contributing to their cost. Maya had developed an impressive ability to reframe every boundary conversation as an attack on her character or an attempt to punish her for being in crisis. Any practical concern I raised became evidence that I was being unsupportive of someone who'd been through trauma. The guest room transformation was perhaps the most telling example of Maya's gradual takeover. What had started as a temporary sleeping space became a fully furnished bedroom that reflected Maya's personal style and needs. She brought in her own furniture, decorated the walls with her artwork, installed better lighting, and organized the closet to accommodate her expanding wardrobe. Maya had also acquired significantly more possessions since moving in. Online shopping packages arrived regularly, filled with clothes, household items, books, decorative objects. Her explanation was that she was rebuilding her life after losing so much when she left David, which was understandable, but the volume of purchases suggested someone who felt settled and permanent rather than someone preparing to move out soon. The spare bedroom now looked like Maya's established personal space rather than a temporary accommodation. She'd invested time and money in making it comfortable and attractive, which seemed to contradict her claims that she was actively looking for her own place. When friends visited my apartment, they'd often comment on how nice Maya's room looked, how well she'd decorated it, how settled and comfortable she seemed. The implication was always that Maya lived there, not that she was staying there temporarily while getting back on her feet. Maya's work situation had also stabilized in ways that should have facilitated her moving out but somehow didn't. She'd returned to full-time teaching, was earning her regular salary, and had access to the employee benefits that provided health insurance and other support. Financially, she was in a position to afford her own housing. But Maya had developed what seemed like analysis paralysis about apartment hunting. Every place she looked at had some fatal flaw: too expensive, too small, wrong neighborhood, sketchy landlord, inadequate parking. She'd spent months viewing apartments and researching options, but never seemed to find anything that met her extensive criteria. Her standards for housing had apparently increased significantly since staying in my comfortable, well-located apartment. Places that would have been perfectly adequate for a teacher's salary when she was desperate for emergency housing were now insufficient for someone who'd grown accustomed to my nicer neighborhood and spacious living situation. Maya had also developed a network of local friends and activities that were geographically centered around my apartment. She joined a gym nearby, found a preferred coffee shop, established relationships with my neighbors, integrated herself into the social and practical ecosystem of my building and neighborhood. Moving to a different area would require rebuilding all of those connections, which Maya seemed reluctant to do. She'd created a life around my apartment that would be disrupted by actually finding her own place. The most frustrating aspect was Maya's apparent inability to understand why I might want my space back. When I'd hint about timeline or mention that I missed having the apartment to myself sometimes, Maya would react with hurt confusion. Wasn't I happy with our living arrangement? Didn't I enjoy having company and shared household responsibilities? She seemed genuinely puzzled by the idea that I might prefer living alone, might want privacy, might need space that was entirely my own. Maya interpreted my desire for independence as rejection of her personally, rather than a normal preference for personal space and autonomy. The conversation always ended with Maya reassuring me that she was looking for her own place and would be out soon, but her actions suggested someone who was settled and comfortable rather than someone actively working toward independence. I began to realize that Maya had no intention of leaving my apartment voluntarily. She'd found a living situation that met all her needs: affordable housing in a nice area, built-in social support, shared household responsibilities, emotional comfort, and she saw no reason to give it up. The woman who'd arrived on my doorstep with a few bags and profound gratitude had become someone who viewed my home as her own, my resources as shared assets, and my hospitality as an indefinite arrangement rather than emergency assistance. Maya had made herself at home in the most literal sense possible. She'd simply decided that my home was now her home too, and she couldn't understand why I might have a problem with that. The morning I found Maya's passive-aggressive note about my music being too loud, I knew we'd crossed into territory I never imagined possible. I'd come home from a late work dinner around 10 p.m. and put on some quiet jazz while I wound down from the day, the same routine I'd followed for years in my own apartment. The next morning there was a small piece of paper on my kitchen counter, written in Maya's careful teacher handwriting. "Hey, just a reminder that sound travels through the walls. Some of us have early mornings. Thanks for being considerate." I stared at the note for a full minute, trying to process what I was reading. Maya was critiquing how I behaved in my own home. She was setting rules for my evening routine in the apartment I paid for entirely. She was treating me like an inconsiderate roommate who needed to be educated about proper etiquette in our shared living space. The audacity was breathtaking, but what made it worse was the tone, sweet and reasonable on the surface, but unmistakably condescending underneath. Maya had positioned herself as the responsible adult managing a household and me as the disruptive one who needed gentle correction. When I mentioned the note later that evening, Maya smiled brightly and explained that she just wanted to communicate about household considerations since we were living together. She pointed out that teachers had to get up early, that she'd been having trouble sleeping lately due to stress, that she was just trying to create a harmonious environment for both of us. All reasonable points, except for the fact that I hadn't agreed to modify my behavior in my own home to accommodate someone else's schedule. I'd been playing music at normal volume during reasonable hours, something I'd done for years without ever receiving complaints from my neighbors above, below, or beside me. But Maya had apparently decided that my living habits needed supervision and adjustment to meet her standards of appropriate household behavior. She was treating my home like her domain, where she had equal say in establishing rules and expectations. That note was the beginning of what felt like a systematic campaign to train me into being a more suitable roommate. Maya started leaving gentle reminders about various household issues: the thermostat setting that was wasteful, the dish soap brand that was harsh on her sensitive skin, the coffee maker schedule that didn't align with her morning routine. Each note was framed as helpful communication between considerate housemates, but the cumulative effect was that Maya was attempting to manage and modify my behavior in my own apartment. She'd appointed herself as the household coordinator responsible for optimizing our shared living situation. The suggestions started extending beyond noise and utilities into my personal habits and lifestyle choices. Maya mentioned that I seemed to work too much, that I should try meditation instead of wine to relax, that my dating life seemed chaotic and emotionally unhealthy. She offered these observations as caring friend concerned about my well-being, but they felt invasive and judgmental. Maya seemed to believe that living in my apartment gave her insight into and authority over my personal life. She'd comment on my phone conversations, ask intrusive questions about my work stress, offer unsolicited advice about my relationships and career decisions. When I brought home dates, Maya would insert herself into our interactions in ways that felt deliberately disruptive. She'd emerge from her room to chat with us in the living room, asking personal questions and sharing embarrassing stories about me under the guise of being friendly and welcoming. One particularly mortifying evening, Maya cornered a man I'd been seeing for a few weeks to tell him that I seemed really stressed lately and probably needed someone who could provide emotional stability and support. She positioned herself as the caring friend looking out for my best interests, but the effect was to paint me as someone with problems who required special handling. I was furious, but when I confronted Maya about the inappropriate intervention, she seemed genuinely confused by my anger. She'd been trying to help, she explained. She thought he should understand what kind of support I needed. She was looking out for me the way good friends do. The incident made me realize that Maya saw my personal life as partially her responsibility and domain. Living in my apartment had given her a sense of ownership over my choices and relationships that extended far beyond normal roommate boundaries. Maya's criticism of my lifestyle became increasingly pointed and frequent. She'd make comments about my grocery choices, my spending habits, my work schedule, my social life, always framed as friendly concern but clearly expressing disapproval of how I ran my own life. She seemed particularly bothered by my independence and self-sufficiency. Maya would suggest that I should be more open to help from others, that I tried to control too many things myself, that I had trouble letting people take care of me. These observations felt like subtle attacks on my character disguised as psychological insights. The most infuriating aspect was Maya's complete inability to recognize the irony of her position. She was living rent-free in someone else's apartment, using someone else's resources, depending entirely on someone else's generosity, while simultaneously criticizing that person's life choices and offering unsolicited advice about how they should live differently. Maya had somehow convinced herself that her dependence on my housing and support gave her the right to evaluate and improve my personal habits. She'd reframed her position as my caretaker rather than my dependent, someone who was helping me become a better person rather than someone whose entire living situation was subsidized by my kindness. The social dynamics became equally problematic. Maya's teacher friends now treated my apartment as their regular hangout space, arriving without invitation and staying for hours. They'd spread their work across my dining room table, use my kitchen to prepare meals, help themselves to my food and drinks, all while I felt like an outsider in my own home. Maya encouraged this casual use of my space, telling her friends to make themselves comfortable, offering them access to my streaming accounts and Wi-Fi passwords, treating my apartment like a community resource rather than my private home. When I suggested that perhaps they could meet at other people's places occasionally, Maya looked hurt and explained that my apartment was the most convenient location for everyone. She pointed out that I should be happy to have friends around, that social connection was important for mental health, that I seemed to be isolating myself too much lately. Maya had reframed my desire for privacy and control over my own space as antisocial behavior that needed correction. She positioned herself as the socially healthy one who was helping me learn to be more open and welcoming. The financial dynamics became increasingly one-sided and presumptuous. Maya never offered to contribute to rent or utilities, but she'd begun making suggestions about how I should spend my money. She thought I should invest in a better sound system for our living room, upgrade to a larger TV, buy higher quality coffee for our shared morning routine. She'd also started making larger purchases for the apartment without consulting me: expensive candles, throw pillows, kitchen gadgets, decorative items, then expecting me to be grateful for her efforts to improve our shared space. When I mentioned that I preferred to be consulted before changes were made to my apartment, Maya seemed hurt that I wasn't appreciative of her taste and initiative. Maya had begun treating my apartment like her own home, where she could make improvements and investments, while simultaneously expecting me to fund the utilities and basic expenses that made her comfortable living there possible. The most painful realization was how completely Maya had lost sight of what I'd sacrificed to help her. She showed no awareness that living alone had been my preference, that hosting a long-term houseguest was a significant disruption to my life, that supporting her housing and basic needs represented a substantial ongoing gift. Instead, Maya seemed to view our arrangement as mutually beneficial. She provided companionship and household help, I provided space and basic resources. In her mind, we were both contributing to a shared living situation that met both our needs. Maya couldn't see that the arrangement was entirely one-sided, that she was receiving housing, utilities, food, emotional support, and social infrastructure, while I was receiving nothing but the gradual erosion of my privacy, autonomy, and personal space. When I tried to express appreciation for her help with household tasks, Maya would wave off my gratitude and explain that we were partners in maintaining our shared home. She'd positioned herself as an equal contributor to our domestic life, rather than someone whose entire living situation depended on my continued charity. The entitlement was staggering, but it had developed so gradually that Maya seemed unaware of how completely her perspective had shifted. She'd gone from grateful emergency housing recipient to presumptuous permanent resident to critical household manager, all while maintaining the narrative that she was the generous friend helping me learn to live better. Maya's social media posts during this period were particularly revealing. She'd share photos of my apartment decorated with her touches, talking about how much she loved her new space and how settled she felt. She'd post pictures of dinners she'd cooked in my kitchen, calling it her favorite room in her new home. She'd also begun sharing inspirational quotes about friendship and support, posts about the importance of helping people in crisis, gratitude messages about how blessed she felt to have such wonderful people in her life. But none of these posts explicitly acknowledged that her comfortable new life was entirely dependent on someone else's ongoing generosity. Maya had crafted a social media narrative where she was thriving in her new independent life, surrounded by supportive friends, successfully rebuilding after trauma. The reality that she was living rent-free in someone else's apartment with no timeline for independence was nowhere visible in her online presence. The most frustrating part was watching Maya's confidence and sense of entitlement grow as her dependence on my support deepened. Instead of becoming more grateful as the months passed, she became more critical and demanding. Instead of working toward independence, she settled more deeply into dependence while positioning herself as my equal or even my superior in household management. Maya had transformed from someone seeking temporary help into someone providing permanent improvement to my life. She'd rewritten our relationship dynamic so thoroughly that she couldn't see the exploitation anymore. She genuinely believed she was the generous friend helping me become a better person and homemaker. The woman who'd arrived at my door with nothing but gratitude and a desperate need for safety had become someone who felt entitled to critique my lifestyle, manage my household, and improve my personal habits while contributing nothing but her presence to the life I'd built and maintained entirely on my own. Maya had become the ungrateful guest who'd forgotten she was a guest at all. Maya had become the ungrateful guest who'd forgotten she was a guest at all. I watched this transformation with a mixture of disbelief and growing anger. The woman who'd sobbed gratefully on my couch just months earlier was now lecturing me about proper household management in my own home. The person I'd rescued from an abusive situation had become someone who felt entitled to manage and critique the person who'd saved her. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't Maya's behavior, it was how skillfully she'd rewritten our entire dynamic while making me feel like I was the one with unreasonable expectations. She'd convinced herself, and was working to convince me, that I was the problem in our living arrangement. Maya had perfected the art of being ungrateful while appearing generous, demanding while seeming helpful, controlling while claiming to be supportive. She'd turned my kindness into a weapon against my own comfort and autonomy. And somehow I was supposed to be grateful for the privilege of housing someone who'd appointed herself as my life coach, household manager, and personal improvement project supervisor. The guest had become the host, and the host had become the unwelcome intruder in her own life. The lease renewal notice arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, 8 months after Maya had first knocked on my door. I was drinking coffee and sorting through mail when I found the letter from my landlord, a routine annual communication about renewing my lease for another year, with a modest rent increase that was typical for the area. I set the letter aside to review later, not thinking much about it. My lease had always been a simple matter between me and my landlord, something I handled privately as part of managing my own housing situation. But when Maya emerged from her room an hour later, she immediately zeroed in on the official-looking envelope. She asked what it was about, and I explained casually that it was my lease renewal notice. Maya's reaction was immediate and intense. She wanted to know what the new rent would be, whether I was planning to renew, what timeline we were looking at for making decisions. The pronoun caught my attention immediately. We. Maya was talking about my lease renewal as if it were a decision that affected both of us equally, as if she had standing to be involved in my housing arrangements. When I pointed out that the lease was mine alone and didn't involve her, Maya looked genuinely confused. She reminded me that she'd been living there for months, that she'd established residency, that any changes to our living situation would obviously affect her too. Her presumption was staggering, but what happened next was worse. Maya suggested that this might be a good time to add her name to the lease, to make our arrangement official and legal. She could contribute to rent, she explained, and having both our names on the lease would provide security for both of us. I stared at her, trying to process what I was hearing. Maya was proposing to transform what I'd offered as temporary emergency housing into a permanent legal roommate arrangement. She wanted to be added to my lease in my apartment without ever having asked if I wanted a roommate in the first place. When I told her that I preferred to live alone and wouldn't be adding anyone to my lease, Maya's expression shifted in a way that made my stomach clench. The hurt confusion I'd seen before was gone, replaced by something calculating and cold. She pointed out that she'd been living there for 8 months, that she'd established legal residency, that she couldn't just be asked to leave without proper notice. Maya was threatening me with tenant rights in my own apartment, suggesting that her unauthorized long-term stay had given her legal protections against eviction. The conversation that followed was surreal and terrifying. Maya calmly explained that she'd done research on tenant rights, that someone who'd been living somewhere for more than 30 days with the permission of the primary tenant had certain legal protections. She couldn't be asked to leave immediately, she informed me. Any eviction would need to follow legal procedures. I realized that Maya had been planning this moment for months. Her gradual transformation from grateful guest to entitled resident hadn't been unconscious adjustment to trauma. It had been a deliberate strategy to establish legal standing in my apartment. Maya had researched tenant law while living rent-free in my home. She'd established residency while claiming to look for her own place. She'd integrated herself into my life and space while preparing to use legal threats to maintain her position. When I asked directly if she was threatening to fight any attempt to ask her to leave, Maya's tone became sweetly reasonable again. She wasn't threatening anything, she explained. She was just pointing out the reality of our situation. We lived together now. Any changes would need to be handled properly, with consideration for both our rights and needs. Maya suggested that we sit down together to discuss the lease renewal, to make decisions about our shared housing situation like the adult roommates we'd become. She wanted to review the financial arrangements, establish formal agreements about responsibilities and expectations, create a proper foundation for our ongoing cohabitation. I told her clearly that I didn't want a roommate, that I'd offered temporary help which had extended far beyond what I'd intended, that I needed her to make concrete plans to find her own housing within the next 30 days. Maya's response was to burst into tears. She couldn't believe I was trying to kick her out, she sobbed. After everything she'd been through, after all the progress she'd made in healing and rebuilding her life, I was going to make her homeless again. She reminded me of her domestic violence history, her trauma, her vulnerability. She painted my request for her to move out as a cruel abandonment of someone who'd trusted me with her safety and recovery. But underneath the tears and emotional manipulation, Maya's message was clear. She wasn't leaving voluntarily, and she would use every legal and emotional weapon available to fight any attempt to make her leave. The conversation ended with Maya locked in her room, sobbing loudly enough for me to hear through the walls. When she emerged hours later, she was composed and businesslike. She'd been thinking about our situation, she announced, and she had some proposals for how we could work things out. Maya had prepared a detailed plan for our continued cohabitation. She would start contributing $400 monthly toward rent and utilities, less than half the actual cost, but she positioned it as a generous gesture given her teacher salary. She would take over more household responsibilities to balance out the financial arrangement. We could establish clear guidelines for guests, privacy, and shared space usage. The proposal was presented as a reasonable compromise that addressed my concerns while acknowledging our mutual needs. Maya framed it as the mature, logical solution to our temporary disagreement about housing arrangements. But I hadn't agreed to any housing arrangement in the first place. I'd offered emergency help that Maya had transformed into permanent residence without my consent. Her proposal wasn't a compromise, it was an ultimatum disguised as negotiation. When I declined her offer and reiterated that I needed her to move out, Maya's mask slipped completely. She told me I was being selfish and unrealistic. I couldn't just kick someone out who'd been living somewhere for 8 months. I was being unreasonable about normal roommate arrangements. Maya accused me of leading her on, of letting her get settled and comfortable before changing the rules. She claimed I'd never been clear about the temporary nature of her stay, that I'd encouraged her to treat my apartment as her home. She was rewriting history in real time, erasing months of conversations where I'd asked about her apartment hunting timeline, where I'd expressed that I missed living alone, where I'd hinted that the arrangement was supposed to be temporary. Maya had convinced herself that I'd agreed to be her permanent roommate and was now reneging on our deal. In her version of events, I was the one acting in bad faith. The next few days were tense and uncomfortable. Maya alternated between tearful emotional appeals and cold, businesslike discussions of tenant rights and legal obligations. She'd researched eviction procedures, consulted online forums about tenant protections, and armed herself with information about my legal obligations as her de facto landlord. Maya also began reaching out to mutual friends and acquaintances, sharing her version of our conflict. She told people I was trying to kick her out suddenly after months of stable housing, that I was being unreasonable about normal roommate negotiations, that she couldn't understand why I was being so inflexible about our living arrangement. Her narrative positioned me as the unreasonable one who was disrupting a stable housing situation over minor disagreements. Maya painted herself as the reasonable party trying to formalize and improve an arrangement that had been working well for both of us. The social media posts during this period were particularly manipulative. Maya shared vague messages about the difficulty of finding housing, the challenges of rebuilding after trauma, the disappointment of discovering that people you trusted weren't who you thought they were. She posted inspirational quotes about resilience and moving forward despite setbacks, about learning to rely on yourself when others let you down. The posts were clearly designed to generate sympathy and support without directly attacking me, while still implying that I was the source of her current housing stress. Friends began reaching out to me, asking if everything was okay with Maya, expressing concern about her situation. When I tried to explain that she was supposed to be looking for her own place, that the arrangement had always been temporary, people seemed confused and skeptical. Maya had been telling our mutual acquaintances for months that we were roommates, that she lived with me, that we had a stable shared housing situation. My sudden insistence that she needed to move out seemed to come from nowhere in their understanding of our relationship. The most devastating realization was how thoroughly Maya had prepared for this moment. She hadn't just stumbled into permanent residence, she'd systematically established legal, social, and emotional positions that made it nearly impossible for me to reclaim my own space. Maya had researched tenant rights while claiming to look for apartments. She'd built social narratives while expressing gratitude for temporary help. She'd established financial and legal footholds while maintaining the fiction that she was working toward independence. Everything I'd interpreted as gradual boundary erosion had actually been deliberate strategic positioning. Maya had been playing a long game while I'd been operating under the assumption that we shared the same understanding of our arrangement. The woman who'd arrived at my door as a domestic violence survivor seeking emergency shelter had revealed herself to be someone calculating enough to research legal strategies for maintaining unwanted residence in someone else's home. Maya hadn't been grateful for my help. She'd been taking advantage of my generosity to establish a position she could defend legally and socially when I finally tried to reclaim my own space. I was trapped in my own apartment by someone who'd weaponized my kindness against me, and she'd done it so systematically that she could paint me as the villain for wanting my own life back. The text message arrived at 6 in the morning, 3 days after I'd given Maya formal written notice to vacate my apartment. It was from our mutual friend Jessica, someone I'd known since college who'd stayed in touch with both Maya and me over the years. The message was short and devastating. "Hey, I heard about what's happening with Maya. I hope you guys can work it out. She's been through so much already." I stared at my phone, trying to process what I was reading. Maya had already reached out to our friends with her version of events, painting me as the aggressor in a situation where I was trying to reclaim my own home from someone who'd overstayed emergency housing by months. Over the next few hours, similar messages trickled in from other acquaintances. Each one expressed concern for Maya's housing situation, disappointment that our living arrangement wasn't working out, hope that we could find a compromise that worked for both of us. The language was careful and diplomatic, but the subtext was clear. Our friends believed Maya was being unfairly kicked out of a stable housing situation by someone who'd become unreasonably demanding about their shared living space. Maya had been busy crafting her narrative while I'd been struggling to understand how my offer of temporary help had become a legal nightmare. She'd reached out to friends, family, colleagues, and social media connections to establish her version of events before I had a chance to explain what was actually happening. Her story was carefully constructed to position herself as the wronged party while avoiding outright lies that could be easily contradicted. Maya told people that we'd been living together successfully for months, that she'd been contributing to household expenses and responsibilities, that she'd thought we had a stable arrangement until I suddenly changed the terms without warning. She emphasized her domestic violence history and ongoing trauma recovery, framing my request for her to move out as particularly cruel given her vulnerable situation. Maya painted me as someone who'd encouraged her to get settled and comfortable, then pulled the rug out from under her just when she was feeling secure again. The narrative was brilliant in its manipulation of sympathy and social dynamics. Maya positioned herself as the victim not just of her abusive ex-boyfriend, but now of a friend who'd promised support and then withdrawn it arbitrarily. She was being victimized twice, first by domestic violence, then by someone she'd trusted to help her heal. Maya's social media posts during this period were masterfully manipulative. She shared quotes about resilience in the face of betrayal, about learning to trust yourself when others disappoint you, about the difficulty of rebuilding when people you relied on let you down. She posted photos of herself looking sad and vulnerable, accompanied by vague captions about facing unexpected challenges and learning to depend on her own strength. The posts never mentioned me directly, but anyone following both our accounts could easily connect the dots about who was causing her distress. Maya also shared articles about housing instability, domestic violence recovery, and the importance of supporting trauma survivors. Her posts created a narrative where she was an advocate for vulnerable people fighting against a system that didn't adequately protect those in need. The implication was that I represented that system, someone who'd offered support conditionally and then withdrawn it when it became inconvenient. Maya had positioned herself as the brave survivor fighting against institutional betrayal, with me as the uncaring institution. Friends began reaching out to offer Maya support and alternative housing options. Some expressed interest in helping her find affordable apartments, others offered temporary space while she looked for permanent housing. Maya graciously accepted their concern and assistance while maintaining that she was doing everything possible to resolve the situation amicably. Meanwhile, I received messages expressing confusion about why I was being so inflexible about roommate arrangements, why I couldn't work with Maya to find a solution that met both our needs, why I was prioritizing my comfort over someone's housing security. The most painful responses came from friends who knew me well enough to be genuinely puzzled by what they saw as uncharacteristic behavior. They remembered me as generous and accommodating, someone who'd always been willing to help friends in crisis. Maya's narrative made it seem like I'd undergone some fundamental personality change that made me cruel and selfish. When I tried to explain the reality of our situation, that Maya had been supposed to find her own place months ago, that I'd never agreed to a permanent roommate arrangement, that she was now threatening legal action to stay in my apartment against my will, people seemed skeptical and confused. Maya had been telling everyone for months that we were roommates, that she lived with me, that we had a successful shared housing situation. My sudden insistence that the arrangement was supposed to be temporary seemed to contradict months of established narrative about our living situation. Some friends suggested that perhaps I should give Maya more time to find alternative housing, that expecting someone to move out in 30 days was unreasonable given the competitive rental market. They encouraged me to be patient and understanding about the challenges Maya faced as a domestic violence survivor trying to rebuild her life. Others recommended mediation or compromise solutions that would allow Maya to stay longer while contributing more to household expenses. They framed the conflict as a normal roommate disagreement that could be resolved through better communication and mutual consideration. Nobody seemed to understand that I'd never wanted a roommate in the first place, that Maya's presence in my apartment was supposed to be emergency assistance that had been extended indefinitely without my consent. The distinction between offering temporary help and agreeing to permanent cohabitation was lost in Maya's carefully crafted narrative. Maya also began reaching out to domestic violence organizations and tenant rights groups, presenting herself as a trauma survivor being illegally evicted from stable housing. She consulted with legal aid attorneys about her rights and options for fighting the eviction. These organizations were naturally sympathetic to someone who appeared to be a domestic violence survivor facing housing instability. They provided Maya with information about tenant protections, resources for fighting wrongful eviction, and emotional support for dealing with housing insecurity. Maya collected letters of support from these organizations, documenting her trauma history and housing needs. She built a paper trail that portrayed her as a vulnerable person being victimized by an unreasonable landlord who was trying to circumvent proper legal procedures for ending tenancies. The bureaucratic machinery of tenant protection began working in Maya's favor, despite the fact that she'd never been an authorized tenant and had no legal right to occupy my apartment beyond my original offer of temporary help. Maya's teacher colleagues also rallied around her, offering support and expressing outrage that someone would try to make a domestic violence survivor homeless. They didn't know the full history of our situation, only Maya's version where she was facing sudden eviction from someone she'd trusted. Her principal wrote a character reference letter describing Maya as a dedicated educator who'd overcome significant personal challenges and deserved community support during her housing crisis. The letter made no mention of the fact that Maya had been living rent-free in someone else's apartment for months beyond the agreed timeline. Maya used these letters and references to apply for emergency housing assistance, presenting herself as someone facing imminent homelessness due to an unreasonable housing situation. She qualified for various forms of support based on her domestic violence history and apparent housing emergency. The irony was devastating. Maya was receiving resources and assistance meant for people genuinely facing housing crises, when her actual situation was that she was being asked to leave free housing she'd been exploiting for months beyond its intended purpose. Maya's family also became involved in advocating for her position. Her sister called me directly to express concern about Maya's situation and ask if there was some way we could work things out. She explained that Maya had been doing so well since moving in with me, that this housing disruption was causing significant stress and trauma. Maya's sister had been told that I was suddenly changing the terms of a successful roommate arrangement, that Maya was facing eviction despite being a good tenant who contributed to household expenses and responsibilities. She genuinely couldn't understand why I was being so inflexible about continuing an arrangement that had been working well. When I tried to explain that Maya had never been invited to stay permanently, that the arrangement was supposed to be temporary emergency help, Maya's sister seemed confused and skeptical. Maya had been telling her family for months that she'd found stable housing with a friend, that she was rebuilding her life successfully in a supportive environment. The conversation made me realize how thoroughly Maya had rewritten our entire relationship history. In her version of events, I'd offered her permanent housing and roommate arrangements, then suddenly changed my mind and tried to kick her out without justification. Maya's narrative was so consistent and convincing that even people who knew me well began to question my version of events. The idea that someone would systematically manipulate emergency assistance into permanent residence seemed too calculating and cruel to believe about someone they knew as a trauma survivor and dedicated teacher. Maya had successfully positioned herself as the sympathetic protagonist in a story where I was the unreasonable antagonist. She'd used her genuine trauma history and professional reputation to build credibility for a narrative that painted me as someone who'd betrayed a vulnerable person's trust. The social pressure became overwhelming. Friends, acquaintances, and even strangers who'd heard Maya's story began treating me as someone who'd done something fundamentally wrong. I was the person who'd abandoned a domestic violence survivor, who'd kicked someone out of stable housing, who'd prioritized my own comfort over someone else's safety and security. Maya had weaponized her trauma and my kindness to create a social reality where I was the villain in a story about helping people in crisis. She'd turned my generosity into evidence of my cruelty, my boundaries into proof of my selfishness. The woman who'd arrived at my door with nothing but gratitude and desperation had become someone capable of orchestrating a sophisticated character assassination campaign, against the person who'd saved her. And the most terrifying part was how effective it was. Maya had managed to convince nearly everyone in our shared social circle that I was the problem, that she was the victim, that justice required supporting her right to stay in my apartment against my will. I was losing the war for my own narrative, fought on battlegrounds I'd never even known existed. It's been 18 months since I finally regained control of my own apartment, and Maya's influence still ripples through my life in ways I never anticipated. The keys she never returned sit in my junk drawer like artifacts from a war I barely survived, reminders of how completely someone can colonize your existence while convincing the world you're the aggressor. The eviction process took 4 months and cost me nearly $8,000 in legal fees. 4 months of living with someone who'd weaponized every kindness I'd ever shown her, who treated my home like a battlefield where she held all the strategic advantages. 4 months of watching Maya perform the role of wounded victim while systematically dismantling my reputation and peace of mind. The legal proceedings were exactly as Maya had predicted: complex, expensive, and emotionally devastating. Her tenant rights attorney argued that she'd established legitimate residency through my initial invitation and extended stay. They presented her as a domestic violence survivor being illegally evicted by someone who'd encouraged her dependence and then abandoned her without proper notice. Maya's documentation was impressive and thorough. She had letters from domestic violence organizations, character references from colleagues, medical records documenting her trauma, and evidence of her contributions to household expenses during the final months of our cohabitation. She'd built a paper trail that painted her as a model tenant being victimized by an unreasonable landlord. My documentation was less compelling because I'd never imagined I'd need to prove that offering emergency help didn't constitute agreeing to permanent roommate arrangements. I had no written agreements, no evidence of her promises to move out, no documentation of the gradual boundary violations that had transformed temporary assistance into indefinite residence. The legal system isn't designed to address situations where someone exploits genuine kindness to establish residence they were never intended to have. Maya's case fit neatly into existing frameworks for tenant protection, while my situation, offering emergency help that was systematically abused, had no clear legal recognition. Maya's attorney portrayed me as someone who'd taken advantage of her vulnerability to create an exploitative housing arrangement, then tried to evict her illegally when she attempted to formalize their agreement. In their narrative, I was the predator and Maya was the victim seeking basic tenant protections. The judge ultimately ruled in my favor, but with obvious reluctance and extensive commentary about the importance of treating domestic violence survivors with compassion and following proper procedures for ending tenancies. I won my case but felt like I'd been found guilty of moral failing even while being legally vindicated. Maya's departure was as dramatic and manipulative as everything else about our relationship. She spent her final week in my apartment staging elaborate emotional breakdowns whenever I was present, sobbing loudly enough for neighbors to hear, making phone calls where she described her terror about becoming homeless again. She left passive-aggressive notes around the apartment during her last days, messages about forgiveness, quotes about how hurt people, reminders about the importance of supporting trauma survivors. Each note was a small psychological weapon designed to make me feel guilty about reclaiming my own space. Maya's actual move-out was orchestrated for maximum dramatic impact. She arranged for friends to help her pack and transport her belongings on a Saturday morning when most of our neighbors would be home. The moving process involved loud conversations about housing instability, frequent references to her domestic violence history, and multiple friends expressing disbelief that someone would kick out a trauma survivor. I stayed in my bedroom during the move, unwilling to subject myself to the performance Maya had orchestrated. But I could hear every word through my walls, the sympathetic responses from her helpers, the discussions about how cruel some people could be, the planning for Maya's temporary stay with various friends until she found permanent housing. Maya left my keys on the kitchen counter with a note that managed to be both grateful and accusatory. "Thank you for the temporary safety. I hope someday you understand the difference between helping someone and controlling them. I forgive you for not being able to see past your own needs." Even in departure, Maya positioned herself as the magnanimous victim forgiving someone too selfish to recognize their own cruelty. She maintained her narrative of moral superiority while finally accepting the reality that she could no longer legally occupy my apartment. The aftermath was more complicated than I'd anticipated. I'd expected to feel relief and satisfaction once Maya was gone, but instead I felt hollow and disoriented. The apartment felt simultaneously too big and too small, familiar yet foreign after months of sharing it with someone who'd gradually colonized every space. I spent weeks deep cleaning and reorganizing, removing all traces of Maya's presence and reclaiming each room as my own. I repainted the guest bedroom, bought new furniture, rearranged everything to match my preferences rather than the compromises I'd made to accommodate her needs. But the physical restoration was easier than the emotional recovery. I'd been living in a state of constant vigilance and resentment for months, always anticipating Maya's next boundary violation or manipulation. Learning to relax in my own space again took time and conscious effort. The social consequences were more lasting than the legal ones. Maya's narrative had taken root in our shared social circle, and many people continued to view me as someone who'd betrayed a vulnerable friend. Some relationships recovered once people heard my side of the story, but others were permanently damaged by Maya's campaign. I lost several friendships entirely, people who'd been convinced by Maya's version of events and saw my eventual legal action as confirmation of my cruelty. Others maintained contact but with a new wariness, as if they couldn't quite reconcile the person they'd known with the one Maya had described. The most painful losses were the friends who tried to remain neutral by maintaining relationships with both Maya and me. They organized separate social gatherings to avoid putting us in the same space, treated our conflict like a divorce where everyone had to choose sides or navigate complex social logistics. Maya's influence extended beyond our immediate friend group through her social media presence and professional connections. She continued posting about housing instability, trauma recovery, and the importance of supporting vulnerable people. Her narrative remained consistent. She was a survivor who'd been betrayed by someone she'd trusted, but was moving forward with resilience and grace. I discovered through mutual acquaintances that Maya had found another temporary housing situation within weeks of leaving my apartment. She'd moved in with a colleague who'd been moved by her story and offered to help during her transition period. The pattern was repeating itself with a new generous host. 6 months later, I heard that Maya had worn out her welcome with that friend as well. According to reports, she'd overstayed her intended timeline and become resistant to suggestions about finding independent housing. The colleague had eventually asked her to leave, and Maya had responded with accusations about abandonment and lack of compassion for trauma survivors. Maya was now on her third temporary housing situation since leaving my apartment, each one following a similar pattern of initial gratitude giving way to entitlement and resistance to independence. She'd apparently refined her strategy based on what she'd learned from our experience, becoming more sophisticated in her manipulation of host generosity. The realization that Maya was systematically exploiting multiple people's kindness was both validating and disturbing. It confirmed that her behavior in my apartment hadn't been unique or personally motivated, but part of a broader pattern of using trauma and vulnerability to manipulate housing from generous people. But it also meant that Maya was likely to continue victimizing others who offered help, using the same combination of genuine need and calculated manipulation that had been so effective with me. Each new host would go through the same cycle of wanting to help, gradually recognizing exploitation, and eventually becoming the villain in Maya's narrative when they set boundaries. I started recognizing Maya's pattern in other people's stories about difficult houseguests and manipulative friends. The combination of genuine crisis, gradual boundary erosion, emotional manipulation, and victim narratives seemed more common than I'd realized. Maya wasn't unique. She was part of a category of people who'd learned to weaponize others' compassion for their own benefit. My own approach to helping others changed dramatically after the experience with Maya. I became more careful about offering assistance, more explicit about boundaries and expectations, more willing to prioritize my own needs alongside others' crises. The guilt about this transformation took months to process. I'd always prided myself on being generous and supportive, someone friends could rely on during difficult times. Maya had taught me that unlimited generosity could be dangerous, that helping others required wisdom and boundaries to be truly effective. I learned to distinguish between people seeking help to improve their situation and people seeking enablement to avoid responsibility for their circumstances. Maya had wanted rescue, not assistance, someone to provide for her indefinitely rather than support her journey toward independence. The dating implications were particularly challenging. Maya's year in my apartment had eliminated my privacy and autonomy in ways that affected my ability to form new romantic relationships. The constant presence of someone monitoring and commenting on my personal life had been emotionally exhausting and and practically limiting. But even after Maya left, I found myself reluctant to bring dates to my apartment or share details about my living situation. The experience had made me hypervigilant about people who might see my generosity as an opportunity for exploitation rather than evidence of my character. I'm more selective now about who I trust with access to my personal space and resources. The openness and hospitality that had once defined my social relationships has been replaced by careful boundaries and explicit expectations. It's a necessary evolution, but it feels like a loss of innocence about human nature and the dynamics of help. Maya taught me that some people view kindness as weakness to be exploited rather than strength to be appreciated. She showed me that trauma, while real and deserving of compassion, can be weaponized to manipulate others into providing indefinite support without reciprocal responsibility. Most importantly, she demonstrated that being generous requires being smart, that effective help includes boundaries, timelines, and accountability measures to prevent assistance from becoming enablement. I still help friends in crisis, but with clearer expectations and firmer limits. I offer specific assistance for defined periods rather than open-ended support that can be gradually expanded beyond its intended scope. I've learned to say no to requests that would compromise my own stability or autonomy. The keys in my junk drawer serve as a daily reminder of these lessons. Every time I see them, I remember both my capacity for generosity and my responsibility to protect that capacity from people who would abuse it. Maya's still out there somewhere, probably telling someone new about the friend who betrayed her, the person who offered help and then cruelly withdrew it when she needed it most. Her story will be convincing because it contains elements of truth, presented in ways that obscure the full reality of what happened between us. And somewhere another generous person is probably listening to that story and opening their door to someone who's learned to turn kindness into a weapon against the people who offer it. I still have the keys she never returned, sitting in my junk drawer like evidence of my own stupidity. But I understand now that they're not evidence of stupidity at all. They're proof that I tried to help someone who needed it, someone I cared about, someone who seemed genuinely desperate for the kind of support I was able to provide. The stupidity wasn't in offering help. The stupidity was in believing that gratitude and good intentions were enough to prevent exploitation, that trauma always produces humility rather than entitlement, that someone's need automatically makes them deserving of unlimited support. Maya taught me that the world is full of people who have learned to weaponize others' compassion, who understand exactly how to present themselves as deserving while systematically exploiting every kindness shown to them. She showed me that some people don't want help. They want rescue, enablement, someone to provide for them indefinitely while they avoid the difficult work of rebuilding their own independence. This isn't a story about not helping people. It's a story about helping people wisely, with boundaries that protect both the helper and the person being helped. It's about understanding that unlimited generosity isn't actually generous, it's enabling disguised as kindness, and it ultimately helps no one. Maya didn't need someone to house her indefinitely while she avoided the challenge of creating her own stable life. She needed someone to support her journey toward independence, someone who would provide temporary assistance while expecting her to work toward self-sufficiency. By failing to set clear boundaries, I actually prevented her from developing the skills and motivation she needed to rebuild her life successfully. The Maya who left my apartment after 18 months was less capable of independence than the Maya who'd arrived seeking emergency help. She'd learned that tears and trauma narratives could manipulate generous people into providing indefinite support. She discovered that victim status could be weaponized to avoid accountability. She'd mastered the art of making other people responsible for her choices while positioning herself as perpetually wronged by their eventual limits. I enabled that transformation by confusing boundaries with cruelty, by treating her gratitude as a guarantee of her good intentions, by assuming that someone who'd been victimized couldn't also be manipulative. I learned too late that trauma survivors, like all people, are capable of the full spectrum of human behavior, including exploitation, manipulation, and calculated self-interest. The most difficult part of processing this experience has been accepting my own role in what happened. Not the role Maya assigned me, the cruel friend who abandoned someone in need, but my actual role as someone who failed to help effectively because I was afraid to help intelligently. I was so concerned with being seen as generous and supportive that I ignored the warning signs of exploitation. I was so invested in being the rescuer that I couldn't acknowledge when my rescue was being taken advantage of rather than appreciated. I was so afraid of seeming selfish that I sacrificed my own needs and boundaries until resentment became inevitable. Maya didn't force me to let her stay beyond the reasonable timeline for emergency housing. I chose to avoid difficult conversations about expectations and timelines because I wanted to be the understanding friend rather than the practical one. Maya didn't make me afraid to set boundaries. I made myself afraid by prioritizing her comfort over my own autonomy. The person who opened her door to Maya that rainy October night wasn't just generous. She was naive about the difference between helping and enabling, between compassion and codependence, between supporting someone's recovery and subsidizing their avoidance of responsibility. Maya exploited that naivety expertly, but she didn't create it. I created it by believing that good intentions were sufficient protection against manipulation, that kindness was always rewarded with gratitude, that helping others was inherently virtuous regardless of the wisdom or boundaries involved. I've had to grieve not just the friendship I thought I had with Maya, but also the version of myself that could offer help without calculating the risks, that could trust people's gratitude as evidence of their character, that could believe in the inherent goodness of human nature without acknowledging its capacity for exploitation. The woman I am now is more careful, more strategic, more willing to say no to requests that feel manipulative or open-ended. She offers specific help for defined periods rather than unlimited support with undefined timelines. She distinguishes between people seeking assistance to improve their situation and people seeking enablement to avoid responsibility for their circumstances. This evolution feels like both gain and loss. I'm wiser now, better protected from exploitation, more effective at helping others in ways that actually promote their independence rather than their dependence. But I'm also more guarded, less spontaneously generous, more analytical about others' motivations and needs. The openness and immediate trust that characterized my friendship with Maya in college would be impossible for me now. I've learned to recognize the difference between someone's crisis and someone's character, between their temporary need and their long-term intentions, between their gratitude and their sense of entitlement. Maya probably tells her story very differently. In her version, I'm the friend who offered help and then withdrew it arbitrarily, who encouraged her dependence and then punished her for it, who used my resources to control her rather than support her. Her narrative positions her as the victim of my manipulation rather than the architect of my exploitation. And perhaps there's truth in her version too. Perhaps I did encourage her dependence by failing to set clear expectations from the beginning. Perhaps I did use my resources to maintain control by never establishing explicit agreements about our arrangement. Perhaps I did manipulate the situation by allowing it to continue without addressing my growing resentment directly. The difference is that my mistakes were errors of generosity, while Maya's were strategies of exploitation. I failed to help effectively because I was afraid to help wisely. Maya failed to receive help effectively because she was determined to receive it indefinitely. Both failures contributed to the disaster of our final months together, but only one of them was deliberate and calculating. Only one of us researched tenant rights while claiming to look for independent housing. Only one of us built a legal and social case for maintaining unwanted residence in someone else's home. Maya turned my kindness into a weapon against my autonomy, my generosity into evidence of my cruelty, my boundaries into proof of my selfishness. She convinced an entire social circle that offering someone emergency housing for 8 months and then asking them to leave was a betrayal worthy of moral condemnation. That level of manipulation requires skill, planning, and a fundamental willingness to exploit others' good intentions for personal benefit. It's not something that happens accidentally or unconsciously. It's a choice, repeated daily, to prioritize one's own comfort over another person's autonomy and well-being. The keys in my junk drawer represent the price of learning these distinctions. They're evidence of an expensive education in the difference between helping and enabling, between compassion and codependence, between supporting someone's journey and subsidizing their avoidance of that journey. I don't regret helping Maya during her genuine crisis. She needed emergency housing when she left David, and I was in a position to provide it. The problem wasn't offering help. The problem was failing to establish clear boundaries around that help, failing to distinguish between emergency assistance and permanent support. Maya took advantage of my failure to set limits, but she didn't force me to fail in that way. She exploited my generosity, but she didn't make me generous without wisdom. She weaponized my kindness, but she didn't make me kind without intelligence. The responsibility for what happened between us is shared, but not equally. Maya bears the responsibility of someone who deliberately exploited another person's good intentions. I bear the responsibility of someone who failed to protect both myself and her from the consequences of unlimited, unboundaried assistance. I learned that effective help requires courage, the courage to set limits, to have difficult conversations, to risk being seen as selfish or uncompassionate in service of actually being helpful rather than merely appearing generous. True compassion sometimes looks like boundaries. Real support sometimes requires saying no. Genuine help sometimes means refusing to enable someone's avoidance of responsibility for their own life. Maya taught me that kindness without wisdom is dangerous to everyone involved. It creates dynamics where helpers become resentful and recipients become entitled, where generosity becomes exploitation and gratitude becomes manipulation. The most generous thing I could have done for Maya was to establish clear expectations and timelines from the beginning, to support her journey toward independence rather than subsidize her avoidance of it, to risk her disappointment rather than enable her dependence. But I was too afraid of seeming unkind to be truly kind, too concerned with appearing generous to be genuinely helpful, too invested in being liked to be actually supportive. The keys remind me that good intentions aren't enough, that helping requires strategy as well as heart, that the most dangerous people are often those most skilled at appearing deserving of unlimited support. Maya is still out there somewhere, probably in another generous person's spare bedroom, probably telling another version of her story to another audience willing to believe that trauma automatically confers moral authority, that need automatically creates entitlement to others' resources. And somewhere another well-intentioned person is probably discovering that kindness without boundaries becomes cruelty to everyone involved, that unlimited generosity creates unlimited opportunity for exploitation, that the road to hell really is paved with good intentions. But those lessons, painful as they are, create better helpers, people who understand the difference between assistance and enablement, between supporting someone's recovery and subsidizing their avoidance of it, between compassion and codependence. The keys in my junk drawer represent survival, wisdom, and the hard-earned understanding that effective help requires not just heart, but intelligence, strategy, and the courage to maintain boundaries even when maintaining them feels unkind. Maya taught me that the most important person to protect when offering help is sometimes the person receiving it, protection from their own tendency to exploit rather than appreciate, to avoid rather than address, to demand rather than reciprocate. Those are expensive lessons, but they're worth every penny of the tuition when they prevent the same mistakes from happening again, when they create space for genuine help rather than disguised harm, when they protect both helper and recipient from the consequences of generosity without wisdom. The keys stay in the drawer not as trophies but as teachers. They remind me every day that kindness requires intelligence, that generosity demands discernment, and that the people most skilled at requesting help are sometimes the least deserving of receiving it without limits. The keys stay in the drawer not as trophies but as teachers. They remind me every day that kindness requires intelligence, that generosity demands discernment, and that the people most skilled at requesting help are sometimes the least deserving of receiving it without limits. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd been wiser from the beginning, if I'd established clear boundaries and expectations from Maya's first night in my apartment. Would she have respected those limits and used the structure to rebuild her independence more effectively? Or would she have simply found a different generous person to exploit, someone less prepared to recognize the signs of manipulation? I suspect the latter. Maya's behavior wasn't reactive to my mistakes. It was strategic, calculated, designed to exploit exactly the kind of person I was. Someone with clearer boundaries from the start would have been a less attractive target, someone whose generosity couldn't be gradually expanded beyond its intended scope. The keys represent more than just the end of our relationship. They symbolize the price of learning that some people's greatest skill is identifying and exploiting others' greatest weaknesses. Maya recognized my desire to be helpful and systematically used it against me, turning my strength into my vulnerability. But they also represent resilience. I survived Maya's manipulation. I reclaimed my space, my autonomy, my right to help people on my own terms rather than theirs. I learned to distinguish between people who deserve help and people who demand it, between those seeking assistance and those seeking rescue. The woman who opens her door now does so with eyes wide open, with clear expectations and firm boundaries, with the wisdom that comes from expensive experience. She's still generous, still willing to help, but she's generous wisely rather than blindly. And that perhaps is the most valuable thing Maya ever gave me, not the friendship I thought we had, but the education that made me capable of better friendships, more effective help, and stronger protection of my own capacity for kindness.